An account of the Inquisition. When the Reformed religion began to diffuse the gospel light throughout Europe, Pope Innocent III entertained great fear for the Romish Church. He accordingly instituted a number of inquisitors, or persons who were to make inquiry after, apprehend and punish heretics, as the Reformed were called by the papists. At the head of these inquisitors was one Dominic, who had been canonized by the Pope in order to render his authority the more respectable. Dominic and the other inquisitors spread themselves into various Roman Catholic countries and treated the Protestants with the utmost severity. In process of time, the Pope, not finding these roving inquisitors so useful as he had imagined, resolved upon the establishment of fixed and regular courts of inquisition. After the order for these regular courts, the first office of inquisition was established in the city of Toulouse, and Dominic became the first regular inquisitor, as he had before been the first roving inquisitor. Courts of inquisitions were now erected in several countries, but the Spanish Inquisition became the most powerful and the most dreaded of any. Even the kings of Spain themselves, though arbitrary in all other respects, were taught to dread the power of the lords of the Inquisition, and the horrid cruelties their exercise compelled multitudes who differed in opinion from the Roman Catholics carefully to conceal their sentiments. The most zealous of all the popish monks, and those who most implicitly obeyed the Church of Rome, were the Dominicans and Franciscans. These, therefore, the Pope thought proper to invest with an exclusive right of presiding over the different courts of inquisition, and gave them the most unlimited powers as judges delegated by him, and immediately representing his person, they were permitted to excommunicate, or sentence to death, whom they thought proper upon the most slight information of heresy. They were allowed to publish crusades against all whom they deemed heretics, and entered into leagues with sovereign provinces to join their crusades with their forces. In the year 1244, their power was further increased by the Emperor Frederick II, who declared himself the protector and friend of all the inquisitors, and published the cruel edicts, namely, 1. That all heretics who continued obstinate should be burnt. 2. That all heretics who repented should be imprisoned for life. This zeal in the Emperor for the inquisitors of the Roman Catholic persuasion arose from a report which had been propagated throughout Europe, that he intended to renounce Christianity and turn Mahometan. The Emperor therefore attempted by the height of bigotry to contradict the report and to show his attachment to popery by cruelty. The officers of the Inquisition are 3 inquisitors, or judges, a fiscal proctor, 2 secretaries, a magistrate, a messenger, a receiver, a jailer, agent of confiscated possessions, several assessors, counselors, executioners, physicians, surgeons, doorkeepers, familiars, and visitors who were sworn to secrecy. The principal accusation against those who are subject to this tribunal is heresy, which comprises all that is spoken or written against any of the articles of the Creed, or the traditions of the Roman Church. The Inquisition likewise takes cognizance of such as are accused of being magicians, and of such who read the Bible in the common language, the Talmud of the Jews, or the Koran of the Mahometans. Upon all occasions the inquisitors carry on their processes with the utmost severity, and punish those who offend them with the most unparalleled cruelty. A Protestant has seldom any mercy shown him, and a Jew who turns Christian is far from being secure. A defense in the Inquisition is of little use to the prisoner, for suspicion only is deemed sufficient cause of condemnation, and the greater is wealth, the greater is danger. The principal part of the inquisitors' cruelties is owing to their rapacity. They destroy the life to possess the property, and under the pretense of zeal plunder each obnoxious individual. A prisoner in the Inquisition is never allowed to see the face of his accuser, or of the witnesses against him, but every method is taken by threats and tortures to oblige him to accuse himself, and by that means corroborate their evidence. If the jurisdiction of the Inquisition is not fully allowed, vengeance is denounced against such as call it in question, for if any of its officers are opposed, those who oppose them are almost certain to be sufferers for their temerity, the maxim of the Inquisition being to strike terror and awe those who are the objects of its power into obedience. High birth, distinguished rank, great dignity, or eminent employments are no protection from its severities, and the lowest officers of the Inquisition can make the highest characters tremble. When the person impeached is condemned, he is either severely whipped, violently tortured, sent to the galleys, or sentenced to death. And in either case the effects are confiscated. After judgment, a procession is performed to the place of execution, which ceremony is called an auto de fe, or act of faith. The following is an account of an auto de fe performed at Madrid in the year 1682. The officers of the Inquisition, preceded by trumpets, kettle drums, and their banner, marched on the 30th of May in cavalcade to the Palace of the Grey Square, where they declared by proclamation that on the 30th of June the sentence of the prisoners would be put in execution. Of these prisoners, 20 men and women, with one renegade Mahometan, were ordered to be burned. 50 Jews and Jewesses, having never before been imprisoned and repenting of their crimes, were sentenced to a long confinement and to wear a yellow cap. The whole court of Spain was present on this occasion. The Grand Inquisitor's chair was placed in a sort of tribunal far above that of the king. Among those who were to suffer was a young Jewess of exquisite beauty, but 17 years of age. Being on the same side of the scaffold where the queen was seated, she addressed her in hopes of obtaining a pardon in the following pathetic speech. Great Queen, will not your royal presence be of some service to me in my miserable condition? Have regard to my youth, and consider that I am about to die for professing a religion imbibed from my earliest infancy. Her Majesty seemed greatly to pity her distress, but turned away her eyes as she did not dare to speak a word in behalf of a person who had been declared a heretic. Now Mass began, in the midst of which the priest came from the altar, placed himself near the scaffold, and seated himself in a chair prepared for that purpose. The chief inquisitor then descended from the amphitheater, dressed in his cope and having a mitre on his head. After having bowed to the altar, he advanced towards the king's balcony, and went up to it, attended by some of his officers carrying a cross and the Gospels, with a book containing the oath by which the kings of Spain obliged themselves to protect the Catholic faith, to extirpate heretics, and to support with all their power and force the prosecutions and decrees of the Inquisition. A like oath was administered to the councillors and whole assembly. The Mass was begun about 12 at noon. It did not end until 9 in the evening, being protracted by a proclamation of the sentence of the several criminals, which were already separately rehearsed aloud one after the other. After this followed the burnings of the 21 men and women, whose intrepidity in suffering that horrid death was truly astonishing. The king's near situation to the criminals rendered their dying groans very audible to him. He could not, however, be absent from this dreadful scene, as it is esteemed a religious one, and his coronation oath obliged him to give a sanction by his presence to all the acts of the tribunal. What we have already said may be applied to inquisitions in general, as well as to that of Spain in particular. The Inquisition belonging to Portugal is exactly upon a similar plan to that of Spain, having been instituted much about the same time and put under the same regulations. The inquisitors allow the torture to be used only 3 times, but during those times it is so severely inflicted that the prisoner either dies under it or continues always after a cripple, and suffers the severest pains upon every change of weather. We shall give an ample description of the severe torments occasioned by the torture, from the account of one who suffered it the 3 respective times, but happily survived the cruelties he underwent. At the first time of torturing, 6 executioners entered, stripped him naked to his drawers, and laid him upon his back on a kind of stand, elevated a few feet from the floor. The operation commenced by putting an iron collar around his neck and a ring to each foot, which fastened him to the stand. His limbs being thus stretched out, they wound 2 ropes around each thigh, which ropes being passed under the scaffold through holes made for that purpose, were all drawn tight at the same instant of time before the men on a given signal. It is easy to conceive that the pains which immediately succeeded were intolerable. The ropes, which were of a small size, cut through the prisoner's flesh to the bone, making the blood to gush out at 8 different places, thus bound at a time. As the prisoner persisted in not making any confession of what the inquisitors required, the ropes were drawn in this manner 4 times successively. The manner of inflicting the second torture was as follows. They forced his arms backward so that the palms of his hands were turned outward behind him, when, by means of a rope that fastened them together at the wrists, and which was turned by an engine, they drew them by degrees near each other, in such a manner that the back of each hand touched and stood exactly parallel to each other. In consequence of this violent contortion, both his shoulders became dislocated, and a considerable quantity of blood issued from his mouth. This torture was repeated thrice, after which he was again taken to the dungeon, and the surgeon set the dislocated bones. 2 months after the second torture, the prisoner, being a little recovered, was again ordered to the torture room, and there for the last time made to undergo another kind of punishment, which was inflicted twice without any intermission. The executioners fastened a thick iron chain round his body, which, crossing at the breast, terminated at the wrists. They then placed him with his back against a thick board, at each extremity whereof was a pulley, through which there ran a rope that caught the end of the chain at his wrists. The executioner then, stretching the end of his rope by means of a roller, placed at a distance between him, pressed or bruised his stomach in proportion as the ends of the chains were drawn tighter. They tortured him in this manner to such a degree that his wrists as well as his shoulders were quite dislocated. They were, however, soon set by the surgeons, but the barbarians, not yet satisfied with this species of cruelty, made him immediately undergo the like torture a second time, which he sustained, though if possible attended with keener pains, with equal constancy and resolution. After this he was again remanded to the dungeon, tended by the surgeon to dress his bruises and adjust the part dislocated, and here he continued until their auto fe, or jail delivery, when he was discharged, crippled and diseased, for life. An account of the cruel handling and burning of Nicholas Burton, an English merchant in Spain. The 5th of November, about the year of our Lord 1560. Mr. Nicholas Burton, citizen sometime of London and merchant, dwelling in the parish of Little St. Bartholomew, peaceably and quietly following his traffic in the trade of merchandise, and being in the city of Cadiz in the party of Andalusia in Spain, there came into his lodging a Judas, or as they termed them, a familiar of the fathers of Inquisition, who, asking for the said Nicholas Burton, feigned that he had a letter to deliver into his hands, by which means he spake with him immediately. And having no letter to deliver to him, then the said promoter or familiar, at the motion of the devil his master, whose messenger he was, invented another lie, and said he would take lading for London in such ships as the said Nicholas Burton had freighted to lade, if he would let any, which was partly to know where he loaded his goods, that they might attach them, and chiefly to protract the time until the sergeant of the Inquisition might come and apprehend the body of the said Nicholas Burton, which they did incontinently. He then, well perceiving that they were not able to burden or charge him that he had written, spoken, or done anything there in the country against the ecclesiastical or temporal laws of the same realm, boldly asked them what they had to lay to his charge, that they did so arrest him, and bade them to declare the cause, and he would answer them. Notwithstanding, they answered nothing, but commanded him with threatening words to hold his peace and not speak one word to them. And so they carried him to the filthy common prison of the town of Cadiz, where he remained in irons 14 days amongst thieves, at which time he so instructed the poor prisoners in the word of God, according to the good talent which God had given him in that behalf, and also in the Spanish tongue to utter the same, that in that short space he had well reclaimed several of those superstitious, ignorant Spaniards to embrace the word of God and to reject their popish traditions, which being known to the officers of the Inquisition, they conveyed him laden with irons from thence to a city called Seville, into a more cruel and straiter prison called Triana, where the said fathers of the Inquisition proceeded against him secretly according to their accustomable cruel tyranny. Then ever after he could be suffered to write, or speak to any of his nation, so that to this day it is unknown who was his accuser. Afterward, the 20th of December, they brought the said Nicholas Burton with a great number of other prisoners for professing the true Christian religion into the city of Seville, to a place where the said inquisitors sat in judgment, which they called auto, with a canvas coat, whereupon in divers parts was painted a figure of a huge devil, tormenting a soul in a flame of fire, and on his head a coping tank of the same work. His tongue was forced out of his mouth with a cloven stick fastened upon it, that he should not utter his conscience and faith to the people, and so he was set with another Englishman of Southampton, and divers others condemned men for religion as well Frenchmen as Spaniards, upon a scaffold over against the said Inquisition, where their sentences and judgments were read and pronounced against them. And immediately after the said sentences given, they were carried from there to the place of execution without the city, where they most cruelly burned them, for whose constant faith God is praised. This Nicholas Burton, by the way, and in the flames of fire, had so cheerful a countenance, embracing death with all patience and gladness, that the tormentors and enemies which stood by said that the devil had the soul before he came to the fire, and therefore they said his senses of feeling were past him. It happened that, after the arrest of Nicholas Burton aforesaid, immediately all the goods and merchandise which he brought with him into Spain by the way of traffic were, according to their common usage, seized and taken into the sequester, among which they also rolled up much that appertained to another English merchant, wherewith he was credited as factor, whereof as soon as news was brought to the merchant, as well of the imprisonment of his factor, as of the arrest made upon his goods, he sent his attorney into Spain with authority from him to make claim to his goods and to demand them, whose name was John Foxe, citizen of Bristol. When his attorney was landed at Seville, and had shown all his letters and writings to the Holy House, requiring them that such goods might be delivered into his possession, answer was made to him that he must sue by bail and retain an advocate. But all was doubtless to delay him, and they forsooth of courtesy assigned him one to frame his supplication for him, and other such bills of petition as he had to exhibit into their holy court, demanding for each bill 8 reals, albeit they stood him in no more stead than if he had put upon none at all. And for the space of 3 or 4 months his fellow missed not twice a day, attending every morning and afternoon at the inquisitor's palace, suing to them upon his knees for his dispatch, but especially to the Bishop of Tarragona, who was at that very time chief of the Inquisition at Seville, that he of his absolute authority would command restitution to be made thereof. But the booty was so good and great that it was very hard to come by it again. At length, after he had spent 4 whole months in suits and requests, and also to no purpose, he received this answer from him, that he must show better evidence and bring more sufficient certificates out of England for proof of this matter than those which he had already presented to the court. Whereupon the party forthwith posted to London, and with all speed returned to Seville again with more ample and large letters, testimonial, and certificates, according to their requests, and exhibited them to the court. Notwithstanding, the inquisitors still shifted them off, excusing themselves by lack of leisure, and for that they were occupied in more weighty affairs, and with such answers put him off 4 months after. At last, when the party had well nigh spent all his money and therefore sued the more earnestly for his dispatch, they referred the matter wholly to the bishop, of whom, when he repaired to him, he made answer, that for himself he knew what he had to do, howbeit he was but one man, and the determination appertained to the other commissioners as well as to him, and thus by posting and passing it from one to another, the party could obtain no end of his suit. Yet for his importunity's sake they were resolved to dispatch him. It was on this sort. One of the inquisitors, called Gasco, a man very well experienced in these practices, willed the party to resort to him after dinner. The fellow being glad to hear this news, and supposing that his goods should be restored to him, and that he was called in for that purpose to talk with the other that was in prison, to confer with him about their accounts, rather through a little misunderstanding, hearing the inquisitors cast out a word, that it should be needful for him to talk with the prisoner, and being thereupon more than half persuaded that at length they meant good faith, did so, and repaired there about the evening. Immediately upon his coming, the jailer was forthwith charged with him to shut him up close in such a prison where they appointed him. The party, hoping at the first that he had been called for about some other matter, and seeing himself contrary to his expectation cast into a dark dungeon, perceived at length that the world went with him far otherwise than he supposed it would have done. But within 2 or 3 days after, he was brought into the court, where he began to demand his goods, and because it was a device that well served their turn, without any more circumstance, they bid him say his Ave Maria. The same was written word by word as he spake it, and without any more talk of claiming his goods, because it was needless, they commended him to prison again, and entered an action against him as a heretic, forasmuch as he did not say his Ave Maria after the Romish fashion, but ended it very suspiciously, for he should have added moreover, Sancta Maria Mater Dei, and by abbreviating it, it was evident enough, they said, that he did not allow the mediation of saints. Thus they picked a quarrel to detain him in prison a longer season, and afterward brought him forth upon their stage disguised after their manner, where sentence was given that he should lose all the goods which he sued for, though they were not his own, and besides this suffer a year's imprisonment. Mark Bruas, an English master of an English ship called Dominion, was burned in a city in Portugal. William Hooker, a young man about the age of 16 years, being an Englishman, was stoned to death by certain young men in the city of Seville for the same righteous cause.